a lot of things the president said tonight about COVID were not only lies, they were dangerous lies. In talking about himself, he said, "I'm good with masks. I tell people to wear masks." That's a lie about his own behavior. The president, even very recently, has continued to ridicule his Democratic opponent, Joe Biden, for wearing a mask and to ridicule other people for wearing masks. He's told reporters at the White House to take off their masks. There's been multiple source reporting that he has told people inside the White House that they should take off their masks. So the president saying that he's good with masks just isn't true in terms of his own behavior. More insidiously, though, twice tonight, the president mischaracterized, I should be more blunt, lied about a CDC study. We sort of knew this was coming tonight because he lied about this study today at a rally in advance of tonight's town hall. We think this is something that he got off of Fox News Primetime, where one of their hosts also lied about this study and misstated its implications. This was a CDC study of people who were COVID positive. And it interviewed them, a small number of COVID positive people, interviewed them about whether or not they had worn masks over the course of the pandemic. A Fox News host in recent days, the president today at this rally, and the president twice tonight at this town hall, perverted that entirely and said that the result of that study is that 85% of people who wear masks get COVID. Absolutely not true at all. And it may be that the president doesn't understand even basic science and the organization of studies. But talking to a small group of people who have COVID and asking them whether or not they wore masks at some point during the country's experience with the pandemic is in a completely different universe of facts from the president saying 85% of people who wear masks get COVID. He's essentially telling you that if you wear a mask, you are going to get COVID. It's not only fantastically wrong, it's fantastically dangerous when the science tells us that actually wearing masks is one of the main things that we can do as a country, as individual citizens, to slow the spread of the virus and to prevent ourselves from getting it. More importantly, to prevent ourselves from giving it to others. People like his embattled CDC director have been very clear about that. Dr. Fauci, of course, has been very clear about that. The CDC has been very clear about that, including since the president started mischaracterizing this study. The CDC tweeting out yesterday, quote, "The interpretation that more mask wearers are getting infected compared to non-mask wearers is incorrect." It's just wildly irresponsible for the president to be telling that lie and telling it twice tonight on this town hall. He did it at his rally, so we knew it was coming, but he did it twice tonight. It is not true that 85% of people who wear masks get COVID. That is absolutely bunk. And coming from the president, it's potentially deadly bunk. The president also said tonight, we have cures. He said, you can use that word. We have cures for COVID. Not only is that wrong and tragic, but the president telling people that there's a cure for COVID is, again, dangerous. He is telling people who believe what he says about COVID, despite all the evidence that you shouldn't. He's telling people who believe what he says about COVID that it's a curable disease. It's not a curable disease. There is no cure. And the president is promoting that there is, and it's both wrong, again, and dangerous. We're going to actually have some expert help a little later on this hour to tell you exactly why the president was wrong when he also said, and he brought out a note card or something to help him with this lie, when he said that the United States has actually done very well compared to other countries in terms of our COVID death rate. That's, again, exactly backwards. The president started talking about excess mortality and how we've done very well compared to other countries. The Journal of the American Medical Association, literally just this week, just 2 days ago, just did an extensive study comparing the U.S. COVID death rate and U.S. excess mortality rates with other similarly situated countries around the globe, with other relatively wealthy, relatively well-off countries. And they found exactly the opposite of what the president said tonight. I'm reading directly from that study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, quote, compared with other countries, the U.S. experienced high COVID-19 associated mortality and excess all-cause mortality into September 2020. U.S. death rates from COVID-19 and from all causes are higher than even other countries with high COVID-19 mortality. The president trying to sell exactly the opposite of that tonight. He's telling people, don't wear masks. It's dangerous. Oh, also, I've been super pro-mask. Both of those things aren't true. He's telling people there's a cure for COVID. There isn't. And he's telling us that the United States has done better than other countries in terms of surviving COVID. All just complete horse hockey from the president.